This week on Inside Olympia, balancing preservation of forests with the mandate to earn income from state trust lands. How is Washington's new Commissioner of Public Lands approaching those twin demands? Plus, we take stock of this year's fire season. That and more when we spend the full hour with Commissioner Dave Upthegrove.
From the TBW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
Welcome to Inside Olympia. Washington's Department of Natural Resources is no stranger to controversy and tensions. The agency must balance the needs of a diverse constituency and manage state trust lands for the near term and the long term. The state's lands commissioner oversees DNR and is accountable to voters as a statewide elected official. So how is Washington's newly elected lands commissioner acclimating to the job? Why did he order a pause on logging in some older forests right out of the gates? And how did his first fire season as commissioner go? Joining me now, and for the full hour this week, is State Lands Commissioner Dave Upthegrove. Welcome to the program. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Been a while since we've sat down. It's certainly the first time we've been able to visit since you took this new position, so congratulations on that.
Thanks.
A little bit of background on our guest before we begin here. Commissioner Upthegrove was elected last November and took office in January. His priorities include climate change mitigation, sustainable forestry, habitat restoration, developing carbon markets, and public access to natural lands, with a focus on balancing ecological protection and rural economic development. Previously, he served 5 terms in the Washington State House from 2002 to 2014, representing the 33rd District. In the House, he chaired the House Environment Committee. From 2013 until last year, Upthegrove served on the King County Council. He is also the state's first openly LGBTQ state lands commissioner. Here's some background on the Department of Natural Resources. It manages 5.6 million acres of forest, agricultural, aquatic, and commercial lands. That includes 3 million acres held in trust for public schools and institutions, and 2.6 million acres of aquatic lands. The DNR generates revenue through timber leases and resource development. The department also oversees forest management, reforestation, and disease control. It is the lead agency on state wildfire prevention and suppression, including operating an aviation unit, plus DNR enforces the Forest Practices Act on private lands. Other responsibilities that fall under DNR's umbrella include mapping earthquake and landslide hazards and regulating surface mining, also developing climate resilience strategies and renewable energy siting policies. It also promotes conservation and recreation on DNR lands. This is reminding me of my last conversation with an agency head. All of these agencies have these huge portfolios, so it's like, where do you even begin? But let me start with just asking you why, after a career that involved serving in the state legislature, serving on the King County Council, why did you want this particular statewide elected position? What was it that attracted you to this job?
You know, I grew up here in Washington State and spent my childhood as a young Boy Scout hiking around every corner of this state, and later worked for the Scouts, teaching environmental science to young people out on Hood Canal, leading week-long treks to the North Cascades. And that led to a lifelong love and intellectual curiosity and passion for natural resources and the environment. It shaped my academic pursuits, went off and got a degree in environmental science and biology, and later a graduate certificate in energy policy. And throughout my public service in the legislature and county government, I always gravitated towards leadership positions around these issues. Chair of the House Environment Committee in the legislature. King County, I took on a not glamorous but very important job leading our flood control district in King County. And I felt that this experience in state government, local government, and this background gave me some valuable insights into how to work collaboratively with local governments. And it really was the culmination of a lifetime spent on environment and natural resource issues. And for me, as you were talking through the list of all the things that this agency does, for someone with a science background and who loves the outdoors, this is sort of a dream job and a chance to really make a difference in the management of these public lands.
As I noted, it can be an acrimonious role. And, you know, historically, I think that people perhaps approach this, the public might have thought of this as, okay, either the person in this role is an industry person or they're an environmentalist. And my sense is that your predecessor, Hillary Franz, really tried to, blend those two things or tried to find a way to the middle. But I am curious about how you're thinking about this, because it does put into tension at all times the sort of push and desire to continue to harvest these forests, for instance, if we're talking about forests, on the one hand, and those who want to preserve more. And so that's constantly in tension. What's your sort of overriding philosophy, or how are you approaching this, given that that tension exists always?
Yep. I come to this job with strong conservation values, and I'm leading with them. This agency has constitutional and statutory responsibilities as well. And yes, I'm realizing you get beat up from all sides, and I certainly am.
Nobody is ever happy, it seems, right?
Yes. It's the nature.
Or at least fully happy.
I think it's the nature of public service, and particularly in this role, whether people supported me politically or not, people on all perspectives have their views. And the way I view it is that's okay. Everyone advocates for their interests, and my job is to sort out what's in the public interest, to make sure we're managing these public lands in the broad public interest for all the people of the state of Washington, while meeting our constitutional responsibilities to the trust. And what it means is that these lands don't belong to industry. They belong to we the people. They're public lands, they're our lands, and have to be managed in the public interest. All the decisions we make as an agency involve listening to a diverse set of interests and finding a path forward that's in the public interest. And for me, that means making sure we are taking into account both economic as well as the long-term environmental and ecological consequences of our decisions.
Okay. I do want to spend quite a bit of time during our conversation today talking about forest policy. But before we do that, let's talk about something else that's been in the news of late. And the timing, I think, is right to talk about this, which is the wildfire season that hopefully is starting to subside and come to an end. We are now into October. According to your agency's own statistics, there were more than 1,800 fires this year, more than 237,000 acres burned. That's pretty equivalent to what happened last year. Dramatically different, though, than if you go back 20 years and look at 2005, when there were fewer than 1,000 fires and just 27,000 acres burned. So, magnitudes more fires and acreage being burned in this day and age. You were just up on Blewett Pass holding a press conference, I think it was the end of September, where there were closures, still active fires. I think things have settled down a little bit, but how would you appraise and evaluate this year's fire season? Then we'll talk about some of the budget and suppression issues that you're dealing with.
Sure. This year's fire season, as you noted, was pretty comparable to the past. We'll end up with probably a little bit more acres burned and a few more fires starting than last year. We're seeing fire seasons lasting longer. It's actually the start of October. People were starting to put up their Halloween decorations, and we still had 2 fires raging just east of the mountains. And so we are seeing longer fire seasons. This one was challenging and a little bit later because of a lot of lightning strikes up in Northeast Washington late in the season. We also are seeing this as more of an all of Washington issue. We're seeing more starts on the west side, not just the east side of the mountains. And that makes sense given that humans are the primary cause and we have population centers over here. So I did a lot of learning. I made it out to quite a few fires to learn about the operations, to support our fire professionals. I'd be neglect if I didn't express my appreciation to the thousands of young men and women who, while we're comfortable in our homes, are slogging through the mountains fighting these fires on behalf of the people of the state of Washington. They do incredible work.
When you think about, we've had years where entire towns were wiped out, like Malden, Washington, a few years back. When you think about a year like this, where there was a lot of acreage burned, but perhaps not the devastation to homes that we've seen in past years, did we just dodge a bullet? Was there some reason for that?
I think there is a reason for that. The legislature a few years back wisely chose to invest in wildfire prevention and community resilience as well as response. They passed a piece of legislation that said they would provide $500 million That's $125 million every 2-year budget cycle. And that allowed the department to work on prevention, things like forest thinning in areas that are just ripe for wildfire, prescribed burns that also help reduce fire, community resilience, helping individual homeowners and property owners manage their property safely, but it also provided significant funding to invest in the resources we need, aviation equipment, fire detection cameras. to help
Yeah,
us
you actually
detect
have a network now of AI
Yeah, it's
enhanced
really cool.
cameras that spot the smoke early.
before human eye even can.
And did that help this year? Did you guys get early detection because of that network of cameras?
I don't have the statistics on the cameras themselves. I have been told generally that they have been an effective tool and have resulted in notifications to our dispatch center.
I think there's 22 of them now. Did you say that?
Yeah, low 20s, and there's more on the way coming up. It's something that we think is very, very helpful. And what we really see makes the difference are those forest health treatments. There was a big fire down at the gorge this year.
Yeah.
Got a lot of attention. They called it
And homes were burned down there. I drove by that. There was
Yeah.
quite a lot of damage.
but it could have been a lot worse. The funding the legislature gave us provided equipment and training to the local fire department. They were first on scene. And the fire chief of that local fire department pulled me aside and said that training and equipment made the difference. That funding the legislature gave us also funded the aviation assets we used to help put out the fire. And even more importantly, that funding from the legislature was used to create fire breaks around white salmon and some of the areas that were high value because of human structures. Just 1 or 2 years prior, the department went in and thinned out the underbrush and cleared it out so the forest was healthy and it reduced the risk. Our fire professionals say when they went to respond on that initial attack, the fire had hit those breaks and had slowed down just enough for them to be able to do their initial attack before it got into a residential neighborhood. We went out and we looked at 2 individual homes where one of the homeowners had participated in our fire prevention programs and the other one had not. The home that participated survived, the one that didn't had not. So this money the legislature provides really makes a difference.
Well, what is the status of that funding?
Yep. Last year, instead of providing us $125 million for the biennium, the 2 years, they only provided us $60 million. So what it means is moving forward, unless the legislature restores that funding, we're going to see more fires, bigger fires, and it will probably cost taxpayers a lot more on the back end because by law, the legislature reimburses us for response. We're like an emergency room. You show up at the emergency room, you get treated no matter what. If there's a wildland wildfire, we put it out no matter what. We have agreements with other states, interlocal agreements, and then the legislature gets the bill and they transfer the money out of emergency reserves. I expect that the costs of responding to wildfires will increase if we decrease the prevention. And just to give you a sense, I mentioned the 2 fires burning east of the mountains. The state share of the cost just for those 2 fires is about $500,000 a day. If this prevention work stops or reduces just a couple big fires, it more than pays for itself.
But in a big picture, we have so many thousands of acres of unhealthy forest, and it's not just DNR land, it's federal, it's perhaps to some extent private lands. And I remember talking to your predecessor, Hillary Franz, about this, that she would tout, okay, we got this additional money to go do forest health, but it always seemed like it was such a drop in the bucket, or that you were working, on the margins when the problem is so vast. How are we going to get our arms around the broader crisis in forest health in this state and tens of thousands of acres that are at danger of catching fire and burning hot and fast?
It is a forest health crisis. As the climate changes, we're seeing the forest health crisis get worse. We see an increase in pathogens, insects, disease. The way we've been dealing with it is by prioritization and careful targeting. We have a very deliberative process that identifies those areas at highest risk and where they're the greatest assets to protect. And those investments have made a difference in almost every major fire that has occurred. So it isn't as if this money isn't making a difference in protecting life and property, but the need is as often the case in public services, in many aspects of public service, is challenging.
Just lastly then, what's your message to lawmakers, especially going into a supplemental budget year when budgets are once again going to be quite constrained?
We'll continue to share information about the impacts of decisions. And in this case, without the funding restored, I think it's safe to say we're going to see more fires. We're going to see bigger fires. And if wildfire isn't a legislator's main concern, I think if they want to have more money to spend on other priorities, the most fiscally prudent decision to consider would be whether or not we can save money by investing in prevention. I know everyone says that. I'll give you an example. Early childhood advocates will say you reduce prison costs if you invest early childhood education. The difference here is it can be darn near immediate. I mean, it's possible that if we don't have the equipment we need, the training we need, the investments in those forest health around high critical communities, we could see those costs almost immediately climb.
I thought of one other thing I want to ask you before we move on, and that is there were weeks of headlines locally and nationally, in fact, about firefighters who were at a camp on the Olympic Peninsula fighting a fire in the Lake Cushman area. They were contract firefighters, I believe, and ICE agents came in and arrested some of them. I know they weren't your firefighters, but can you tell us about sort of the effect of that, or how, what information were you getting, and what was your response and reaction to that happening?
First, I'll say, regardless of anyone's views about federal immigration policy, enforcing it at the site of an active emergency against people responding is the wrong thing to do. If immigration enforcement had concerns with someone's visa, they could have addressed it after the fire. It was the wrong thing to do. At the time, I was provided information that said there was a criminal investigation underway relating to potential financial fraud, timesheet fraud, and it was an investigation of a criminal nature that resulted in a review of people's time cards and documentation, and that led to a discovery of some immigration violations. Since then, I have some questions about whether that was a pretext or not. But what is true is that federal officials on the fire itself, on that response team, contacted Border Patrol and invited them to the fire. These are federal agency staff, and so this wasn't necessarily an example of ICE showing up cruising fires the way they have in some communities. But I have real concerns about that, about someone on that incident management team, other federal officials, inviting immigration officials to the site of a fire. And let me be clear, these were firefighters. One of the things I resent, and I think a lot of folks in our agency resent, is the characterization that just because they weren't holding the hose, they aren't firefighters. Our firefighters do a lot of work clearing brush, holding hoses. These were folks with red cards who are out there helping with that fire. And so trying to come after firefighters for immigration violations while they're actively responding to a wildfire hopefully won't happen again.
What does it tell us about these were contract firefighters? Were they contracted with then the federal government?
Yeah, U.S. Forest Service.
U.S. Forest Service. What does it say just in terms of employers ensuring that people who are employed are lawfully here? What does it say about the sort of, like, have you had to go back and take a look at the relationship that DNR has with contract? Do you have any contract firefighters?
Yes.
That you guys, so did this prompt a conversation at all about ensuring that those contractors and their employees are filling out their I-9 forms and that there's no fraud and that everybody who is fighting the fires is lawfully present?
I don't think it took this incident. I think our agency has, particularly with all of the attention and scrutiny on immigration from this administration, has been diligent at making sure we're documenting everything, that we're protecting our employees as well. There's a lot of, just speaking for myself, I think there's a lot of intentional fear that's being created by this administration, and we feel it among our employees. Even those who are here legally present are experiencing fear, and so we are trying to make sure all of our paperwork for everyone's in order.
Let's pivot, and I want to talk to you about something you did right out of the gates. In fact, I believe on day one, which was this pause on timber sales in certain forests. And subsequently, in August, you issued a commissioner's order allowing logging to proceed on a fraction of that land and preserving the remaining amount. I think it was 77,000 acres preserved, 29,000 acres logged. These are not old-growth forests. You have a term of art that you use, complex.
Structurally
complex. So they're older forests, not old growth. Just as a starting point, what is it about these forests that, from your perspective, demanded taking first day action in this fashion and sort of hitting that pause button as you've described it?
Yep.
Or a timeout.
Yep. These older structurally complex forests make up a pretty small part of our state land holdings, but they have an outsized impact on habitat in particular, as well as our climate. And we've always had as sort of a desired outcome of our forestry plans, having a mix of forest types across the landscape, some younger, some older, some very old and structurally complex. And that's part of how we maintain biodiversity, so that we maintain our economic sustainability of forestry in this state. And I paused them on day one for a couple reasons. Number one, to get a better assessment of what forests we have where, basically to update our forest inventory data. How many of these forests do we have? Where are they located? And I also paused and didn't make a final decision because I wanted to get out and listen to industry, to school districts, to counties, to tribal governments, and just get more input and discussion around this question of how do we manage these older forests in more innovative and diverse ways that can do more for climate, more for habitat, and still meet our responsibilities economically and constitutionally.
So then in August, you issued this commissioner's order preserving 77,000 acres, allowing 29,000 acres to be logged. As you indicated, nobody's really happy in the end, or at least not entirely happy. Why, how did you come to that decision?
Sure. I made a commitment to the public that I was going to make progress in this area. It was central to my campaign for this office, and it's important to me to stay true to the commitments I make. When we looked at 77,000 acres, it turns out we had more than that. We have a little over 100,000 acres. Mm-hmm. So that number ended up being a nice, what I would call a sweet spot, because it allows us some short-term stability, to minimize or avoid any fiscal impacts to schools, to counties, to our agency, while we pursue ways to innovate and diversify our management on those lands. And that's some of what creates the controversy, is that some are going to be harvested. And that gives us a runway of time and stability to start looking at alternative management. And it might be helpful to say what was in that commissioner's order. It was actually really simple. It said, asked our staff to identify 77,000 acres of structurally complex older forests, including all of our older forests, which is a subset of the most ecologically value. And then it said, on these lands, begin exploring alternatives to variable retention harvest. That's how we usually harvest. These are traditional harvest methods. It doesn't specify which 77,000 acres, and it doesn't say how we will manage them. It does acknowledge that we have responsibilities under in the Constitution and under state law that we intend to comply with. Mm-hmm. And it gives us a chance. We have some of the best scientists, best foresters. We have some of the best practices when we do harvest, environmental practices, probably in the world as an agency. And I want to do more for climate and habitat. And these same smart individuals, I think, can help us innovate. We have ecosystem service markets, carbon markets. We have more ecological forestry, thinning for forest health, and to accelerate stand stage development can generate money. We also can have a history of acquiring replacement timberlands to help generate revenue if we're not getting as much off of these lands from ecological forestry and ecosystem service markets.
So you're interested in looking for new avenues of revenue on these trust lands that might not involve logging. Let me, and I hope we can kind of get
Certainly as
or
much logging.
right.
It might involve some thinning.
Sure.
And
I hope we'll have time to get back to sort of some of what that might look like in more specificity. Let me walk you through some of the criticisms on both sides here.
I've heard them.
Well, yes, I'm sure you have. So one is a process criticism. The Seattle Times editorial board said that this executive order was done without hearings or board approval, that it was untransparent, and that you are out over your skis now. How would you respond to that criticism about the process that you undertook over this 6 or 7 or 8 months?
Sure. I'd say it's longer. I spent a year and a half talking about this publicly. We debated it here in this TV studio.
When you were a candidate.
Yeah, as a candidate. So there's nothing new. And the reason we waited 6 months, that 6 months pause, was to do that. I met monthly with the industry representatives. I went out and sat down with any tribe that would meet with me. I sat down with 20 of the 29 tribal councils, met regularly with conservation leaders. The action that was taken is one that is simply an operational direction to staff, so it isn't something that goes to the board or the legislature. But when I meet with legislators last session, I always gave them updates, and I don't think there's been an issue relating to the Department of Natural Resources that has been more discussed from more different levels, and I absolutely met regularly with the stakeholders. In fact, my very first meeting, I think after elected, was with the Trust Land Advisory Committee for the Washington School Directors Association. So I've been out listening to the folks who get money from our timber sales as well.
There was also criticism about the impact of this. The Seattle Times editorial board says diminishing revenues from timber sales will deprive cash-strapped school districts and hurt local governments that fund fire and emergency response, infrastructure upkeep, and more. Debbie Regala and Jim Buck, lawmakers who wrote and sponsored the Forest and Fish Law back in 1999 that sort of set in place a lot of how we manage our forests, co-wrote an op-ed that said that, and this was, I think, during the time that the pause was in place, that this was essentially upending well-established forest policy, having an impact on local communities, and criticizing, again, your approach. How do you respond to that criticism on the side of you shouldn't be clamping down on harvest?
I understand. There's a lot of people who benefit from the status quo and a lot of people who are comfortable with the status quo. I believe that our world is changing. We're seeing a rapid loss in biodiversity. We're seeing the impacts of climate right now, and we need to innovate and diversify to keep up with that reality of today. And we can do it thoughtfully, and we can do it in ways that sustains rural economies and does support jobs. I understand change brings fear. It always does. That's why we built a runway of stability. I sometimes joke that the folks in the industry send out a news release saying he's stopping the usual harvest to 77,000 acres. The environmentalists send out on the same day a news release, he's cutting down 29,000 acres. I get that everyone's going to advocate for their interests. Times have really changed since my friends Senator Regala and Representative Buck were in the legislature. Our habitat conservation plans don't mention the word climate anywhere. It's okay to innovate and diversify. I also don't think the current system is serving us well. The solution to local government finance and school finance isn't going to come through the Department of Natural Resources. We need to fully fund our public schools and not pit kids against trees. The tools we have available, we can turn the knob a little bit one way or the other, and all those challenges are still going to remain. This was a system created 150 years ago. This used to pay those federal lands that were given to us, used to be 40% of our school capital budget. Those federal lands, and that's just some of the lands we manage, you count up all the timber revenue on all of those federal trust lands, they account for 1.5% of the state share of new school construction. That's a mouthful, but what it means is if you pass a school bond, you get some matching funds from the state. 1.5% of those come from timber sales. That shouldn't be driving our timber policies. Long-term sustainable economic benefit and ecological management should be driving it. That being said, we also manage some lands for the counties, and those generate important revenue for local governments, including schools. And that's why our proposal provides stability and goes and seeks to innovate and diversify how we generate revenue for those tax districts.
Okay, I do need to stop you for a quick break, but we'll pick this up when we come back. When we return, we continue our in-depth interview with State Lands Commissioner Dave Upthegrove. Back after this.
Stolen vehicles are a problem. We need a solution. Pursuits are not the solution to that.
Washington State is not missing high-speed police pursuits. Washington State is missing the possibility of a high-speed pursuit.
Driver fled.
Watch all of TVW's award-winning shows on your time at tvw.org.
Welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me once again is State Lands Commissioner Dave Upthegrove. And I want to just continue with this sort of line of questioning. So with respect, you were saying sort of this outdated model that we're using. On the other hand, what I hear is that the forest products ecosystem is an ecosystem too. And that if you turn the dial here and stop some amount of logging that was expected and planned, that it can have impacts on mills, and especially the mills that are handling these larger diameter trees that are needed for certain wood products like power poles. And then you jeopardize the mills being able to operate, the jobs that are, that the people those mills are employing, and it has this ripple effect. So I want you to sort of respond to the economic ecosystem impacts here.
We need to balance our economy and our ecological interests, and we're doing that. One thing that's helpful is to put this in scale. 70% of our forestry activity, of the wood products in the state, come off private timberlands. This doesn't touch anything of that. About 93, 94% of our timberlands aren't impacted by any of this. And on that small percentage of older forests, we're talking about continuing to manage these, and that could involve thinning for forest health, stand stage development that could involve larger diameter wood products.
But as I understand it, there are mills that are actually quite dependent on this DNR logging.
Yes, and that's why the vast majority of this isn't changing. We're talking about a small subset of ecologically valuable lands.
So would you sit here today and say, as a result of this order, that no mills will close and no jobs will be lost?
That is the intent of that. This is a small percentage of our overall holdings, and we're approaching this in a way that maintains the vast majority of the timber activity. I expect there to be fear, and I have found often that the timber industry overstates. They will, I'm sure, dispute that. But the thought that we can work over the next 5 years here on ways to innovate and diversify the management on a small subset of our older forests that are publicly owned, I believe we can do that in ways that strengthen rural economies. I'll give you an example. A critical piece of this is both ecosystem service markets, thinning for wood products, but also seeking replacement timberlands. I'll give you an example. Just this month, in fact, we're moving forward purchasing about 6,000 acres over in Cle Elum Ridge that if we didn't buy it, maybe would end up with what I call McMansions, some housing sprawl over there. We're purchasing it. We're putting it back into active forestry. This agency has a history of expanding our trust holdings and preventing forest lands at risk of conversion from converting, and we bring them and put them into forestry. There also are opportunities under our existing habitat conservation plans, and those are the plans that protect certain forests for spotted owl and marbled murrelet. Not all of those acres have turned out to be really good habitat for the owl. The stands haven't developed into that structural complexity that we need. So there's opportunities if we're managing some of these structurally complex forests in more ecologically, more habitat-based approaches to pursue minor amendments to habitat plans to allow some of that to be harvested.
To open up some other areas that have been off limits.
Yeah, and we'd want to have a
heretofore.
big public process. So replacement timberlands can be a part of that solution.
One more criticism on the side of you shouldn't have shut any of this acreage off or taken any of it offline, or shouldn't be taking any of it offline. Hillary Franz, your predecessor, said it's better to source wood from Washington State from elsewhere because we have better environmental standards. She said part of why these forests are more mature is because of environmentally oriented forest practices that allows trees to grow longer. And therefore, now they're ready. And we should be logging here because if not, we're going to be getting it from overseas, from some place that's not as environmentally protective. How do you respond to that?
I think there's a fallacy in that argument. You hear that in other public policy areas. If we don't use coal, then people will go use coal elsewhere. We need to do our part to meet the climate crisis, to address habitat. We can't control what other jurisdictions will do. We can only control what we do. And while those are good assumptions, there is no guarantee that the market plays out exactly in that way. It's an argument I'm familiar with, that if we don't do it, then someone else will. Well, I've heard that for 20 years in different aspects of public policy. We can't do things better because then people will shift and do things in ways that are less environmentally friendly. And the one thing I agree with is we do have an exceptional staff that do prepare these timber sales according to forest practices rules that are better than on private timberlands, and probably to the extent the feds are cutting anything, federal timberlands. But I don't think we should use that as an excuse to not do more for climate and biodiversity.
So on the flip side of the ledger, obviously some environmental groups have criticized this decision, but criticism has also come, and I just thought this was interesting, from Bill Bryant, who's the former port commissioner, King County Port Commissioner, Seattle Port Commissioner, and former candidate for governor who ran as a Republican. He, I believe, traveled this week from the east side of the mountains to Port Angeles to testify about planned cuts in the Doc Holliday region, I think this is called. And he has argued that you should be protecting more of these forests. In fact, he noted that if it's about 120,000 acres of these kind of complex forests,
About
100, it's less than 5% of DNR managed lands by his math. Given the climate crisis and what you said during the campaign, I think the question he would ask is, shouldn't DNR be working to save all of this acreage right now? What would you say to Bill Bryant, who is a conservation-minded Republican in the state?
Yep. I think very highly of Bill Bryant and his advocacy. Change doesn't happen overnight. We do need to innovate and diversify our management of these lands and do more for habitat and more for climate. But we need to do it in a way that maintains some level of stability, both for schools and counties, but also for the agency itself. I'll give you a sense that some of the timber sales that were paused that are moving forward, were those to remain paused, that's a $30 million hit, $20 million to schools and counties, $10 million to us as an agency. I want to be thoughtful. I want to move us in a new direction. I want to do it in a way that brings public support with us in the long term. And my concern would be if all of those acres were deferred for now from harvest, that impact fiscally would not be manageable, nor would it be sustainable. I made a commitment to 77,000 acres, and I intend to honor that commitment. But it's important to do it in a way that's thoughtful, a way that's balanced, and that brings people with us.
So let me go one step further. Yeah. He acknowledged the financial implications here and proposed, he said, Washington, he wrote this in an op-ed, I think, in the Tacoma News Tribune. He said in 25-27, Washington budgeted over $170 million for climate change activities. It currently plans to spend over $120 million of that on studies and hiring more state employees. Instead, those funds should be used to compensate local governments for forests we won't cut in order to protect watersheds in an era of disappearing glaciers and to purchase new timber trust lands that can be managed for carbon sequestration. That's his proposal is get creative, definitely don't leave people, without the money they were expecting, but look for sources of funding to sort of pay people despite the not harvesting.
Yep. I like the way he thinks. That doesn't happen overnight. Take a look at the state budget situation right now. It doesn't look like they have hundreds of millions of dollars to spend on a new initiative right now. At the same time, they've cut our wildfire funding in half and have made other deep cuts to the agency. But that is exactly the kind of innovation and diversification that I'm talking about. I just think we need a little bit of a runway of time, some stability and certainty while we work on replacement timberlands, while we work on changes to financing, while we try to get into ecosystem service markets, while we explore ways to generate revenue off of smart ecological thinning. It's kind of, I kind of had two options. You could blow the place up, in essence, stop that harvest and then go try to put those pieces in place. What I'm suggesting is provide some stability and try to bring people together to start putting those kinds of pieces in place.
So speaking of that future that you envision, how much of it would take legislative approval? When do you imagine going to the legislature with a specific ask? You've mentioned carbon sequestration a couple of times, these sort of other ideas. You have a 4-year term, right?
Yep.
What is the timeline and the actualization plan?
Sure. The priority that we'll be pursuing immediately is asking the legislature for authority to enter into ecosystem service markets.
And you got to define that.
Yeah, I was just, you stole the words. I'd say most people will say, what? The one people are most familiar with, people have probably heard folks talking about the carbon market. And that's where governments or private industry can get compensated in real dollars for things they do to reduce carbon emissions. In the forestry sector, we've seen it most in the California carbon market for improved forest management practices. So you do things like longer rotations or less intensive forestry. You can essentially get paid for those carbon emissions avoided. There are emerging markets in other areas. The idea, philosophically, conceptually, it's great. In practice, it's challenging. The idea is that forests have value for things other than wood products. How do you monetize those values? And around the world and in the U.S., people have developed systems to monetize the carbon values. So we are asking explicit permission from the legislature.
To be clear, in the next session?
In this upcoming session, yes. And there has been legislation bouncing around for a few years. We're going to have agency request legislation that allows us to do that. That won't fully replace the revenue from wood products, but it can be a meaningful piece of that solution, accompanied with perhaps some thinning that could generate some revenue, accompanied by investments in replacement timberlands, which tend to be more opportunistic as they come on the market.
Because, and then we're going to move on, because things take a long time here, what do you say to timber-dependent communities? And, I'm thinking about the people, and we see them on the roads all the time, the log truck drivers, right? The mills, the loggers in the forest. And, there is the sort of environmental ecosystem of these forests, and then there is an economic ecosystem. They can't, if you're earning revenues by not logging, they're not making money. And if you're going to go acquire some different set of lands to be logged, that doesn't happen overnight. What happens in the meantime? What do you say to these communities, to these individuals, to these mills?
In the meantime, we've provided that stability over these next 5 years.
Because you left some of this land online.
That's the short, simple version of it, is that we're going to maintain or seek to maintain comparable harvest levels through. In 5 years, that's what our tactical plans are. That's the first thing. The second thing is these forests will still be managed, and often thinning for forest health, thinning for stand stage development can create more jobs in the woods. It might not create as much money for a real estate investment trust or a timber investment management organization, but we can still have good jobs in the woods.
I also know you said that you think this is an outdated model, but the other reality is that the revenues we're getting off of these state lands is less and less. And in fact, I don't even think the projections are being met. So in some respects, it feels like maybe this is a false promise to the communities that depend on this, to this idea that we're going to maximize revenue while also trying to manage for the future.
Yep. I think this whole notion that timber harvest is the solution to rural economic development, school finance, and local government finance is sort of where that false promise is. And I think we need to be looking at other models as a state to supplement this work. And I don't believe that changing how we manage a small set of older forests is going to have the kind of adverse economic impact that some of the critics from the industry suggest. I think there is a model where we can actually employ more people in the woods directly on forest health, on thinnings. It might be a little bit of a different economic model on this small piece of lands, but keep in mind, again, 70% of our forest products come off private timberlands. 90 to 95% is not changing off our state lands. This whole debate is around a small subset of some very ecologically valuable forests.
Let me talk to you about the next hot button issue. I think is going to be the next hot button issue is that the Forest Practices Board is proposing a pretty large increase in stream-side buffer requirements. I think it's up to 140% wider on streams without fish. Critics are saying that this rule would bypass legislative approval, remove 235,000 acres from private working forests, cost jobs, shutter sawmills, and hurt the timber supply. What is your view of this? What is your response to that idea that these are not apparently even fish-bearing streams, and the buffers are going to be much wider, and that's going to have a significant impact, again, on the timber industry?
Yep. First of all, this is a decision that is made by something called the Forest Practices Board, and our agency has a vote on it. In fact, our agency serves as the chair of that board, so it's not a DNR agency decision. We implement it at the end. I think those assertions from industry are overstated and don't match the analysis that was provided by our scientists and by the independent economic analysis that board did. This was always envisioned. The board, since its inception, had always envisioned setting buffers on non-fish-bearing streams. So that notion wasn't new. The Forest Practices Act is really a special piece of legislation in this state because it came about when tribes and industry and the environmental community had been suing each other over private timberlands, not the state lands we've been talking about, the private timberlands. People called it the Timber Wars. And those parties got together and they hashed out a set of rules and a process for amending those rules. And the process involved a lot of complicated steps at something called the Forest Practices Board through what was called the adaptive management process. There's a whole lot of words there, but really that timber and fish agreement laid out a process for how to change those rules. And that was the process that was very carefully followed over many, many years. And at the end of the day, any impacts to water quality, clean water, also have to be signed off by the Department of Ecology because they have authority for the Clean Water Act. And these new buffers on non-fish-bearing streams were the bare minimum that the Department of Ecology said they could sign off on. So, and they also were recommended by the scientists in our agency. And so our agency representative voted to move this into public comment, and we're currently listening to that public comment. Thousands and thousands of people weighing in on this, and the board, including our representative, will process all that and make a final decision coming up pretty quick.
And your view is you don't think it's going to be as disruptive as some in the industry are saying it's going to be?
The independent economic analysis that the board did showed significant impacts, but it did not match the analysis that the industry is saying.
Okay. We could keep going on this one, but I do need to move on because time is short. I've asked you a lot about forests. Let's move to the aquatic lands. And one specific thing that's happened since you took office, which is there's been a significant drop in kelp as a I guess, populations.
Because I was elected
Not
to office.
okay, we'll be
I'm
clear
kidding.
about that. This predated you, but
I'm kidding.
including an 80% drop in kelp around Squaxin Island here in the South Sound. And I guess that salmon and orca populations depend on that habitat. So you issued an executive order banning leasing for aquatic, I guess, like gooey duck farming and so forth, on 350 acres around Squaxin in that area. What's going on there? Why this action? How big a crisis is this? I'll be honest, I have not heard about this until I started preparing to interview you.
Yep. There's a growing recognition of the role that kelp beds play and eelgrass meadows play in the nearshore ecosystem. In other words, the small fish rely upon these meadows and forests of the sea, and the big fish rely on those small fish, and the king salmon rely on those big fish, and the orca rely on the king salmon. And so it really is one of those sort of linchpins of our aquatic ecosystem. And for reasons still being widely investigated, we've seen a huge decline in these kelp meadows and eelgrass meadows and kelp forests. So the legislature actually stepped in and passed a law directing us to identify and restore at least 10,000 acres of kelp forests. And this was our first major action to do so. It was done with strong support and partnership of the upland owners there, the Squaxin Island tribe. But we're going to need to do more.
Yeah, so that would be it's one thing to do a moratorium in a certain area on aquatic activities, but what is the longer term plan to start to recover this?
Yep. Our aquatic
these forests of the sea, as you described them.
I know our aquatic lands professionals have identified areas of the sound that are best suited and that have historically had these forests, and they're going to work collaboratively with local governments and on developing management plans.
Can you plant new kelp?
Absolutely. Yep.
And would that be the idea?
Yeah, things eat kelp too, we discovered. When I was out at Squaxin Island, several of these new kelp beds were just being devoured by things they called kelp crabs. Oh. I mean, it looked like something out of a horror movie.
What are the implications for the broader shellfish industry in this state, which is very robust, and there's a lot of leased tidelands for this purpose?
I think we can do this in a way that is not going to I don't think it has ever been envisioned that these are going to impact planned leases and sales. One thing we're doing is, for the first time, we're developing an asset management plan for these aquatic lands. We've sort of just been opportunistic when there are gooey duck lease requests, and we're developing a long-range plan that'll account for both these kinds of preservation as well as making sure that that industry is healthy.
Less than 2 minutes left. Just one last question about what do you think DNR's role is in Washington State moving towards a clean energy future, whether that's solar, wind, other forms of electricity?
We have an important role to play in helping our state meet its clean energy requirements. Local utilities are required under state law to produce all their energy from clean energy sources, and was I think
By
2040
2045 or 2040, yeah.
2045. Yeah. We own a lot of land, and I think we can be a part of that, and I'm excited to be. There are challenges with that. We want to make sure we do it in ways that respect tribal cultural resources. We don't want to wipe out valuable agricultural lands or shrub steppe habitat. I'm also a little nervous that by the time we build the iPhone 4, the iPhone 5 will be here. We see.
Are we at the iPhone 17 already?
Yes, I've lost track. The technology is moving fast too, and the length of time it's taking to deploy utility scale wind and solar is concerning. And but I think DNR can play a role. I would like to see tribes in this state really take a leadership role. We have a lot of out-of-state developers. I think this could be a chance for tribal governments to help decide where, when, and how this is being built, and have an economic development tool for tribal governments, because we're seeing a lot of conflict with tribal interests.
Well, it's clear we could have talked for 2 hours, but we only have an hour, so we'll have to have you back in the program. But thanks for the opportunity. Good to see you. Good to talk with you, and we will check back in before long.
Yeah, good.
State Lands Commissioner Dave Upthegrove, and thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We will see you again next week.